In ancient times, when fate took me to military service, the first couple of weeks, while the rest of the recruits who arrived earlier were engaged exclusively in physical training and cleaning up the territory. And now, in addition to the morning race for 3 kilometers, which gradually grew to 10 kilometers, there were mandatory classes at the sport town. And for some reason this spectacle, at first, was repeated many times. In addition to the swing of the press, which now makes no sense to describe, there was also a pull-up on the horizontal bar. It was only necessary to add a certain number of pull-ups, and only later, lift coups were taken into account. But at first, only pulling up, and so many succeeded with difficulty, and from the outside it looked very strange. The writhing body suggested various thoughts, but most importantly, they were not allowed to give up this occupation. Much later, when I myself served quite a lot, it became clear why this was done. The recruit had to hold on to the lasts, because if he is now allowed to quit doing such pull-ups on the horizontal bar, then it will be almost impossible to make any progress later. Simply put, it was about the support that must be kept to the lasts, because if you just quit, then, everything, as we called it then, you will become a scoundrel or unfit for this service and you will be written off with the transfer to the construction battalion or pontoons. Both that, and another then was considered something worse than which only internal troops can be. It was in this place that my limit of possibilities did not appear, since everything was fine with gymnastics, but a little later I had to reach my own limit in other manifestations or see how it manifests itself. All this, moreover, that all 8 years of the war, and especially the last 3.5 months, constitute a very important feature of the Ukrainian army. She reforged herself from a post-Soviet army into a self-sufficient army, with her own spirit and her own idea of what, how and why should be done at this very limit and what should not be done. And now we can safely say that the Ukrainian army is the best, or for sure one of the best armies in defense. There are many factors that can be discussed separately, but in the end, there is one common moment for all armies and it is determined simply, whether the army will run or not, in which case, moreover, a competent and correct withdrawal of the army should not be confused with the flight of the army. Having used all the power of his army, the enemy was just waiting for the moment when the Ukrainians would run at least somewhere. They didn't run. They evaded a frontal strike and hit the flank or rear, but they didn't run, and even more so, they didn't drop their weapons and didn't change into civilian clothes. That is, no matter how difficult it is and no matter how difficult the situation is, the Ukrainian army does not jump off the horizontal bar. This can already be said with certainty on at least one basis. The Ukrainians are not only firmly on the defensive, but they also counterattack in case of any oversight by the enemy. Moreover, they know for sure that there are still no forces for a counteroffensive and it can only be a counterattack, and they do it brilliantly and successfully, without getting carried away, but exactly as much as possible in this situation. This resilience has already been appreciated by Ukraine's Western partners. As a matter of fact, it was precisely this quality that became the guarantee that the Ukrainians began to be provided with the weapons that they are now receiving in an ever-increasing flow. Western partners have now understood that weapons can and should be given, and that the Ukrainians will use them skillfully, competently and charge for victory. All this to the fact that all 3.5 months of the armed forces of Ukraine were in a state of strategic defense, and the enemy was in a state of strategic offensive. With the level of defense that he encountered at the very beginning, he was forced to shorten the front in order to create on it already the maximum superiority in forces and means. And then, he had to cut it again in order to provide, albeit narrow, but the band of an unconditional breakthrough. And let's just say, except for what the enemy captured without a fight in the first week of the war, everything else turned out to be a very small gain, especially considering how much he had to leave in northern Ukraine. But now we are approaching the moment when the enemy is already on the horizontal bar and we will look at how he can pull himself up and how much stamina he has. Now the enemy is throwing everything he has, not to pull himself up, but to at least hang in one place. After all, while he himself is operating in the strategic offensive mode, everything is moving towards the fact that the maximum efforts made for this can simply hold back the front line, which the Ukrainian military is constantly probing, albeit not with deep, but powerful and extremely painful blows. And while the enemy, according to the internal logic of events, is on the offensive, for him it is one war, but as soon as he receives a command to go over to the defense and hold on to the captured, it will be a completely different alignment. And that things are moving towards this, says a lot. We will not dive into the details of what and how is happening at the front, since professionals will do it better, but we will only note that disturbing voices are increasingly being heard from the Russian side that Kyiv is not going to negotiate, and by negotiations, the enemy means a ceasefire and consolidation in the occupied territories, as it was already in 2015. Right today, Sergei Lavrov, who was not allowed into Serbia, went to Turkey, and there, at a meeting with his Turkish counterpart, he spoke about Turkey's influence on Ukraine in terms of resuming negotiations. But we are well aware that talks about negotiations start to be heard from there only when they feel that they are running out of steam. But we remember how Putin personally announced that he was not going to conduct any negotiations and that he would destroy everyone. This is what he said after his Ox got cunts at the first stage and retreated from Kyiv. And then Plan B was adopted as a basis, with the maximum concentration of forces and means in the east of Ukraine, from where it was decided to go to Kyiv later. And now Peskov, Lavrov and some rubbish make their eyebrows look like a house and talk about the fact that they are open to negotiations, but they are not heard. It's just that the Russians still have some phantom reflexes, and it seems to them that Ukraine will surrender its territories to them, and they will stop shooting for this. This is what they call negotiations, and not only is this not needed by anyone, but the situation has changed so that negotiations can be conducted, but only on issues of bilateral interests. Moreover, the liberation of all of Ukraine, including Crimea, is no longer a question. They will not leave on their own, they will remain in the Ukrainian black soil. So this may be of interest to Russians, but Ukrainians are not interested. Another thing is the payment of reparations to Ukraine, the transfer of war criminals, including Lavrov, to the International Tribunal. The demilitarization and defascization of Mordor are really topical topics, but apparently they are not yet ready to discuss them. And by the way, in vain, since these are precisely the issues that are of bilateral interest, since demilitarization can be voluntary, or it can be forced. That is, we can talk about the complete destruction of the entire military infrastructure of Mordor 100 kilometers deep into its territory. If they are not interested, then what? Then it will be done without taking into account their interests. But in this case, the important thing is that they are already whining about the negotiations with the Hull, and this suggests that they know better than anyone else where they will have a moment when they are completely exhausted from their offensive. But this moment, according to the theory of military art, is one of the key factors in determining the time of the start of the counteroffensive. But Mordor, for all these years of the war, has never yet found itself in the role of standing in a strategic defense. Moreover, after the Second World War, he never once saw an advancing, regular army in action. The fact that the Ukrainians know how to defend themselves is no longer the way the Soviet military school dictates. The Russians felt in their own skin, but how the Ukrainians act on the offensive, the Russians have yet to find out. Most likely, they imagine the level of resistance of their army in defense, since it is in this type of combat operations that the moral and psychological qualities of the personnel are decisive. Now they are driving personnel of such quality that they can be driven to the slaughter in an attack, but the Russians will not be able to force the personnel to stand and not run. So the moment is coming when the Ukrainians will test the stamina of the Russians on the defensive, but it is already becoming clear that they are not ready for the format of the fight, when they are already catching you to take your head off. It is not for nothing that there have been reports that the Russians have removed their fleet from the Ukrainian coast for 100 kilometers, because they know that the Ukrainians have already received anti-ship missiles. They did not sign up for such a war, and therefore they moved away. In general, let's look at how ready they are to hang on the horizontal bar,